It's Wednesday, the 12th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper, the leading story. Telcos Tariff hike. Reps demand reversal as new pricing begins. Lawmakers demand improvement in telecom services. MTN, others raise data tariff. You can get all of this story on page 31 of the Punch newspaper and above the leading story from the right. PDP crisis. Wike allies sack BOT chair. Sean Ikeme panel. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. FBN Holdings PLC rebrands as First Holdco. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Punch newspaper and below the leading story. INEC strategizes to tackle vote buying during Anambra governor poll. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the Punch newspaper. Senate grieves IG over 178,459 missing guns. Alleged contract splitting. You can get the complete story on page 44 of the Punch newspaper. Tension as police occupy Osun LG Secretariat over chairman's tenure. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the Punch newspaper. Makinde. APC trade wars over UCH power crisis. You can get the complete story on page 28 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Nigeria Tribune, the leading story. Perished thought of 2027 presidency. Ganduje tells northern politicians, says Tinubu will serve 2 terms. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Customs suspends implementation of 4% FOB levy. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the Tribune. Reps want immediate halt to propose hike in telecom tariff. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the Tribune. Nigerians to pay more for withdrawals as CBN increases ATM transaction fees. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. Federal government to install 100 billion naira solar mini grid at UCH, Unilag, others. You can get the complete story on page 13 of the Tribune. PDP, NWC dismisses Wabara suspension, declares it null, void. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Tribune. FBN Holdings rebrands as First Holdco PLC. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Tribune and below the leading story from the left. Nigeria ranked 36th most corrupt country globally in 2024. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the Tribune. I won't go on exile despite plans to arrest, detain me, says El-Rufai. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. NAFDAC seals Idumota, Ariaria, Onitsha drug markets. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the Tribune. Federal government committed to reducing food prices through agricultural investments, says Information Minister. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the newspaper. Police lost 178,459 firearms as of 2018, says Auditor General's report. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Tribune. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust, the leading story. Abductors of APC National Director demand 350 million naira ransom as General T saga remains in captivity 1 week after. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Federal government suspends 4% levy on imports. You can get the complete story on page 11 of the newspaper. OIC meets over Trump's plan for US takeover of Gaza. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. Reps to begin debate on tax reform bills today. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the newspaper and below the leading story. Nigeria gains points as Transparency International ranks country 36th most corrupt. Report shows Tinubu's government making progress, says presidency. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. Federal government to crash food prices through investment, says minister. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the newspaper. MTN begins 50% hike implementation as lawmakers call for suspension. You can get the complete story on page 28 of the newspaper. Tinubu will seek re-election. North must wait till 2031, says Ganduje. You can get the complete story on page 14 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard, the leading story. CBN hikes ATM charges to 100 naira per 20,000 naira withdrawal. Says no more zero charge for withdrawal from other banks' ATM. ASSBIFI other support increase. Cite rising cost of cash ATMs. Beacon advises bank customers to adjust to increase. You can get all of this story on page 19 of the Vanguard and above the leading story. Customs suspends implementation of 4% FOB charge. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Vanguard. I won't go on exile despite plans to arrest me, says El-Rufai. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Corruption index. Nigeria ranked 140 out of 180 countries. Transparency International. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Reps asks federal government to halt impending hike in telecoms tariffs. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard and below the leading story from the right. APC, Opebelo in this series, unable to defend September 21st electoral heat, says PDP. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the newspaper. Pope Francis faults Trump's mass deportation plan. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. PDP crisis. NWC voids Abia chapter suspension of Wabara. Wabara suspension and insult can't stand, says Bode George. Why we suspended Wabara, Abia PDP. You can get all of this story on page 5 of the Vanguard. NIN now prerequisite for accessing social services, says SGF. You can get the complete story on page 24 of the Vanguard. Presidency. North will take over its turn after Tinubu's 8 years, says Ganduje, APC National Chair. You can get the complete story on page 32 of the Vanguard. World Cup qualifiers. NFF raises alarm over Chile's move to invite Musa. You can get the complete story on page 39 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the next paper, The Guardian, the leading story. ATM withdrawal fee. CBN bets on breaking POS monopoly. Improving banks' cash operations. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian and above the leading story from the left. NWC kicks as Abia PDP suspends Wabara for endorsing Oti's re-election. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. 67% of Nigerian primary, secondary schools aid exams malpractices. You can get the complete story on page 30 of The Guardian. Police face Senate security over 3,907 missing assault rifles. You can get the complete story on page 2 of The Guardian and below the leading story from the left. 2027, El-Rufai warns of APC implosion as Ganduje, Diwala, others differ. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. Valentine's Day. NACA urges Nigerians to shun risky behaviors. You can get the complete story on page 29 of The Guardian. Federal government mandates use of NIN for social services interventions. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. New tariff regime begins as Telcos implement 50% hike on calls data. You can get the complete story on page 15 of The Guardian. 300 die in tanker fire in 4 months, says federal government. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. Amotekun raises alarm over influx of strangers in Ondo Forest Reserves, border communities. You can get the complete story on page 7 of The Guardian. Moving over to the last paper on the list, Business Day. The leading story. Foreign investors' confidence grows as Eurobond yields dip. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, influx of foreign fighters mirrors weak border surveillance. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. Outrage over MTN's data price hike. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. Naira stability lowered business costs in January, says report. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.